Hazel Parker's morning always began with the comforting hiss of the coffee machine at Lou's Diner in Juniper Junction. She'd flick on the lights, adjust the blinds to let in slim bands of dawn, and tie on her trusty blue apron, frayed at the corners from daily use. The diner was only a single-story building perched at the end of Main Street, a place where neighbors came for a slice of homemade pie or a conversation about the latest local happenings. That Wednesday morning it was still dark outside when Hazel unlocked the front door and slipped inside. With a quick flick, the overhead lights hummed on, illuminating the black and white tiled floor and the long counter lined with retro stools. She moved with practiced efficiency, wiping down tables and checking the day's specials scribbled on the chalkboard. A new day in Juniper Junction had begun. As she set the silverware on the counter, she heard a squeak and felt a tiny shift beneath her feet. Startled, she stepped back, then pressed her foot down gently to test the floorboard. There was a slight give, one she had never noticed before. The wood squeaked, complaining in a manner that seemed almost vocal. She smiled, chalking it up to the building's age and comedic timing. Old buildings always had their quirks. A short while later, Lou stepped in from the back alley. He was a stout man in his 60s, with thinning silver hair peeking out from the sides of his worn baseball hat. He ran the diner with a fatherly presence, his round face brightening whenever local kids stopped by after school for milkshakes. "Morning, Hazel," he said, yawning. "You're here bright and early." "Just like every day," she teased. "Everything's in order. Coffee's almost ready." Lou gave a satisfied nod, took a seat at the counter and flipped open the local newspaper. Hazel poured him a mug, and he offered a quick "thank you" as he stirred in cream. He sipped with a pleased sigh, scanning the headlines. The diner opened to the public at 6, and sure enough, the usual dribble of regulars arrived. They settled in at their favorite booths, Mac the mailman, Rosie the librarian, and a few farmers just in from an early milking. Hazel served them scrambled eggs, pancakes, and warm mugs of coffee. Conversations were polite and typical of a small town. Nothing seemed unusual until, while refilling a coffee cup, Hazel overheard something that made her stop mid-pour. A pair of strangers had taken seats in the far corner, leaning in close over their table. One was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket zipped up to his chin. The other had red hair tucked under a fedora, and both had serious low tones that piqued Hazel's interest. "We just need to get under there," said the red-hailed individual, tapping a pen against the tabletop. "It's got to be beneath the floor, in that one spot." "Lower your voice," hissed the taller man, glancing around. "We don't want anyone figuring us out before we have our hands on it." Hazel's eyes flicked to the squeaky floorboard near the register. Her heart gave a little lurch. She was sure they were talking about the diner's floor. She carefully turned her head so she could hear more, but the men ended their conversation and stared at her. Concerned she might betray her eavesdropping with a jumpy expression, Hazel forced a bright smile. "More coffee, gentlemen?" They shook their heads. Neither offered a polite smile, their eyes darting from her face to the floor, then back again. Hazel's pulse raced. She tried to act unbothered, turning away to greet newly arriving customers, yet the short exchange had ignited her curiosity. What secret might be hidden under the diner's floorboards? That curiosity stuck with Hazel throughout the busy morning. She moved from table to table, offering refills and cheerful banter, but her mind kept drifting back to the words she'd overheard. Occasionally, she snuck glances at the pair. They seemed restless, as if eager for the diner to clear out. When they finally separated and walked outside, she watched them go, noticing how one paused by the big picture window to scan the diner's interior like he was memorizing the layout. Once the breakfast rush ended, Hazel joined Lou behind the counter. He was rinsing off dirty dishes left by the overnight baker. "Hey, Lau," she began softly. "Do you know anything about this building's history? The floorboards, specifically." He looked at her with an inquisitive expression. "History, huh? Well, I've owned the place for going on 30 years. Diner's been here even longer, though. Before that it was some kind of mercantile, and before that I heard it might have been a storage warehouse. Anything unusual about it? Hazel asked. Unusual? Not that I recall. Why do you ask? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I overheard a couple of guys talking about something hidden under the floor. It was almost like they planned on coming back later. Lou set down the plate he was scrubbing, then brushed his hands on a towel. Are you sure you heard them right, Hazel? Sounds like the start of a tall tale. She glanced over her shoulder, mindful of the few customers in the diner who were absorbed in their own conversations. I'm pretty sure. They said, under there and that one spot. Lou frowned, deepening the furrows in his brow. I don't recall anything valuable or hidden. The basement's just storage for flour, sugar, canned goods. Nobody ever goes down there but us. Maybe they were talking about a different place entirely. Hazel nodded, but she couldn't shake the disquieting feeling. You're probably right, she said out loud, though privately she held on to her doubts. That afternoon, once the lunch rush subsided and Lou stepped out to run errands, Hazel found herself alone with a mountain of receipts to organize. The constant hum of the fluorescent lights enveloped her. The squeaky floorboard near the register nagged at her like an itch that wouldn't go away. She decided to take a closer look. Bending down, Hazel pressed her palm against the spot. The board gave a quiet groan. She pressed harder, feeling the wood strain. A breeze from the cracked window made the overhead lights tremble, or so it seemed. Gathering her courage, Hazel used the corner of a screwdriver to pry up the edge. The wood refused at first, but after a moment of gentle coaxing, it shifted just enough to reveal a slim gap. She peered into the darkness beneath. The gap was small, barely enough to see through, but she could make out a patch of compact dirt. A flicker in her mind told her this building had a basement. That meant an entire floor lay between her vantage point and the earth. So what was she seeing? The sound of the bell above the front door startled her. In a fluster, Hazel dropped the screwdriver, let the board fall back into place, and stood up. Quick footsteps approached, and suddenly Sheriff Nelson strolled in. He was a lanky man in his 40s, with a kind, weathered face that showed a lifetime of sincerity. "Hey there, Hazel," he greeted. "Any chance you have some leftover chicken pot pie for a late lunch?" Hazel brushed invisible dust from her skirt, pushing away her half-formed questions. "Of course, Sheriff. You got lucky. I have one slice left." As she left him to settle at a table, she couldn't help wondering if she should mention what she'd overheard, but she dismissed the idea. The men had only spoken a few words, and she had no real evidence. The sheriff had more pressing matters to handle than rummaging under diner floorboards. The rest of the day passed in a blur, though the sense of mystery persisted. Hazel went home after her shift, unable to stop thinking about the conversation and that strange patch of dirt beneath the floor. She resolved to do a bit of research the next day, quietly. If there was a story or local rumor about something being hidden in the diner, she'd find it. The following morning, as soon as she finished the breakfast rush, Hazel used her break to slip over to the Juniper Junction library. Rosie, the soft-spoken librarian, perked up from behind her desk when she saw Hazel enter. "Hello, Hazel. Need something specific?" Hazel nodded, lowering her voice. "I'm curious about the building that houses Lou's Diner. Do we have any records on it?" Rosie tapped her chin thoughtfully, then disappeared among the tall shelves, returning with a stack of hardcover ledgers and scrapbooks that chronicled Juniper Junction's past. They settled at a small reading table near the window, dust motes dancing in the golden light. "This is the earliest record for what used to be called Carlisle's General Store," Rosie said, opening a ledger with careful fingers. "It was built around 1920, then it changed hands a few times." Hazel scoured the pages, scanning for anything that might hint at a hidden space. She found old ledger entries of everyday items, nails, flour, feed. Then, in a 1943 record, there was an entry about renovation expenses. A note scribbled in the margin read, "Replaced the old wooden floor with new boards. Space beneath left untouched." She paused, rereading the sentence. It sounded so deliberately vague. "Space beneath left untouched," Hazel murmured. "That's strange." Rosie peered at the note, then shrugged. "It's unusual, but not necessarily suspicious. Maybe they couldn't afford a full remodel." Flipping pages further, Hazel spotted an article about a missing wedding ring from the early 1950 SEs. It mentioned the diner, then still a general store, as the last place the owner remembered wearing it. The ring was never found. The story was overshadowed by a bigger headline about stolen antiques from a local museum. There was a flurry of stories about robberies in the following months, mysterious break-ins, missing items. Eventually the thieves were caught. Except the local rumor was that some stolen goods were never recovered. Hazel felt her pulse quicken. Was it possible that stolen antiques had been stashed under the floor of what was now Lou's diner? It sounded far-fetched, but not impossible. Excitement pulsed through her. She thanked Rosie for her help and let the librarian get back to her duties. Clutching the half-formed theories swirling in her head, Hazel returned to the diner. At the end of her shift, with only a few regulars lingering over dessert, she mustered the courage to mention her discovery to Lou. She found him in the back office counting receipts. "Lou, I think there might be something under the floor in the front. The building's original owners did renovations but left a space beneath the boards. Maybe something was stored there a long time ago." He set his pen aside. "Hazel, you really think there's some hidden treasure under the diner?" Hazel sighed, feeling the beginnings of doubt poking her excitement. "I don't know if it's treasure, but those men from yesterday clearly believe something is there. I think it might tie back to the unsolved thefts from the 1950s. Lou's eyebrows arched high, and he stood, pushing in his battered desk chair. "Why not check the basement? We can see if there's anything unusual. If not, that's that. And if you're right, we'll contact the authorities." She nodded eagerly. They made their way to the basement. Flipping on a single overhead bulb that cast a harsh glow over shelves stacked with canned tomatoes and dusty boxes. The air smelled of old newspapers and potatoes. Together, they marched up and down the narrow aisles. Lou occasionally tapped the walls, listening for hollow spaces. Hazel knelt by corners, rapping on the ceiling. They found nothing out of place, no sign of hidden panels or mysterious compartments. Frustrated, Hazel began to think she had worked herself up over something imaginary. Before turning off the light, Lou gave one last glance around. "If there's anything, it's not accessible from down here," he concluded. "We'd probably have to pry up some of the boards upstairs to see if there's anything but dust and cobwebs." Hazel's adventurous spirit almost leapt at the chance, but she reined it in. "We can't just tear up the diner." Lou nodded. "Good thinking. Let's just keep our eyes open. If anything suspicious happens, we'll call the sheriff." Hazel agreed. For the next couple of days, life in Juniper Junction resumed its comforting normalcy, serving chicken pot pie, topping up coffee cups, and exchanging pleasantries with customers. But in her gut, Hazel knew the calm wouldn't last. Her instincts were proven right one evening after closing. She was finishing up a final round of cleaning when a shuffle of footsteps came from outside the locked front door. Heart pounding, Hazel ducked behind the counter. The handle jiggled and the glass rattled. Were those the same men? She pictured their intense gazes, the hush in their voices. Peering around the corner, she saw a silhouette outside. Then came a soft beep, like a cell phone. The intruder stepped away, disappearing into the night. Hazel's breathing only returned to normal after a few tense seconds. She flicked off the lights and hurried home, vowing to tell Lou first thing in the morning. Early the next day, she informed Lou of the late-night visitor. Together, they called Sheriff Nelson. The officer listened attentively, jotting notes into a small pad. Once Hazel finished her account, he cleared his throat. "I'll keep an eye on the diner at night. the sheriff said, sliding his pen into his front pocket. "And I'll have some of my deputies do a couple of drive-bys. In the meantime, if you see these men again, let me know." The next day slipped by in a hazy routine, the same regular faces filing in for breakfast, lunch, then dinner. Hazel attempted to keep her curiosity in check, but found herself sneaking glances at strangers who walked past the windows, half expecting them to try and pry through the floor the moment her back was turned. That night, the diner closed with little fanfare. Hazel and Lou stacked chairs, mopped the floor, and locked up. The two parted ways in the parking lot, each heading for their cars. The moon was a thin crescent in the sky, and the faint aroma of a distant bonfire lingered in the crisp air. On her drive home, Hazel found her mind drifting to that squeaky floorboard again. The moment she parked in front of her cottage, the notion struck, maybe the spot she'd checked near the register wasn't the only loose board. Perhaps those men had targeted a different area. What if there was a second, older set of boards, hidden by layers of renovations? She recalled that margin note in the ledger, space beneath left untouched. That line carried a kind of finality that suggested something was definitely left there. On her next day off, Hazel coordinated with Lou to come in before sunrise when the diner was empty. They'd do a thorough check of the floor, within reason, to see if anything was actually hidden. They arrived under a navy blue sky, the stars just beginning to fade. Lou brought a small crowbar. Hazel toted a flashlight. They moved through the diner methodically, testing each board, listening for differences. At first, the floor sounded uniform, a dull solidity beneath them. But near the corner booth, where few customers ever sat, Hazel insisted they check. When she pressed down on a plank, a noticeable echo jolted through the silence. She and Lou traded a wide-eyed look. Lou, adjusting his baseball cap, carefully pried at the edge of the plank with the crowbar. It was slow work, each creak and groan amplified in the silent diner, as though the building itself was begging them to stop. They continued, rolling the board back carefully. At last they revealed a shallow space about 18 inches in height. Dust motes clouded the air, making their eyes water. In the beam of Hazel's flashlight, they saw a small metal trunk tucked into the darkness. Its corners were rusted, and the lid bore scratches. Hazel's heart drummed in her chest. She slid the trunk toward her, setting it on the diner's floor. Lou bent down, shining his own flashlight over it. The latch was secured by a simple lock, so rusted that the metal was flaky to the touch. Without waiting, Lou used the crowbar to twist the lock until it broke free with a clang. Slowly, Hazel lifted the lid. Inside was a jumble of old items wrapped in brittle cloth. Gently, she removed them one by one under the warm glow of overhead lights. First were two tarnished silver candelabras, their ornate designs reminiscent of a bygone era. A small pearl brooch, missing two pearls, lay to the side. There was a faded photograph of a couple standing in front of a vintage car. And beneath all that lay something else. A small box that rattled when Hazel picked it up. Inside were a man's gold cufflinks, engraved with initials that had long since worn away. "What are these?" Hazel whispered. Lou stared in awe. "Antiques, probably stolen from a museum or a collector. I remember hearing about some local thefts from the 1950s that were never fully solved. Looks like we just found part of that missing loot." Hazel closed the trunk, adrenaline still coursing through her. She recalled the conversation between the two strangers, how intently they'd spoken about getting under the floorboards. They must have discovered rumors of this stash and come to retrieve it. But Hazel and Lou had beaten them to it. They locked up the trunk in Lou's office cabinet, then immediately phoned Sheriff Nelson. The sheriff arrived within minutes, eyes wide as they showed him the trunk's contents. He nodded gravely, confirming that a few of these pieces matched an old museum inventory list he'd seen decades ago. "I'll contact the museum and some other historical societies," he said, packing the items with gloved hands. "We'll see if we can return everything to its rightful owners." Hazel felt a surge of pride and a wave of relief. She pictured the men she'd overheard, likely lurking around town, waiting to pounce on their chance. Now, they no longer had a secret treasure to seize. Sheriff Nelson assigned a deputy to keep watch over the diner for the next several nights. But it turned out they didn't have to wait that long for the culprits to appear. 2 nights later, around 2 in the morning, the deputy on duty noticed shadows moving near the diner's side windows. He called for backup, and within minutes the men were caught attempting to force their way inside. In the glow of the red and blue flashing lights, the suspects, indeed the same pair who had visited the diner, were handcuffed. As they were loaded into the sheriff's cruiser, Hazel stood by Lou, watching in astonishment. "It's over," she said quietly. Lou nodded, relief easing the tension in his shoulders. "All thanks to you and your curiosity." Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community that their local waitress had solved an old mystery about missing antiques. Though Hazel blushed at the attention, she was secretly proud. Every morning, regulars congratulated her and asked for the story. She tried to keep it brief, humbly brushing off her role as mere good luck. A week after the arrest, Sheriff Nelson stopped by the diner with a broad grin. He ordered a slice of Hazel's chocolate cream pie before pulling out an envelope and tapping it on the counter. "Got some good news," he said, and the local museum curator confirmed that most of these items are from a series of thefts in the early 50s. They'll be returned to the museum, which plans to hold a small ceremony to honor everyone involved in recovering them. That includes you, Lou, and of course you, Hazel. She blinked, feeling both shy and pleased. Lou chimed in. "I'm proud of her." She put the pieces together. The sheriff nodded, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Had a chat with the men who tried to break in. They claimed they heard a rumor. Someone told them there was valuable stash hidden under the floor. Guess that rumor eventually made its way across the state. They were hoping to sell the antiques on the black market, but you two were a step ahead of them." Once he'd left, Hazel paused to absorb the news. It felt surreal that her small act of eavesdropping had led to uncovering decades-old stolen artifacts and solving a hidden piece of Juniper Junction's history. The day of the museum ceremony dawned bright and clear. With Lou's blessing, the diner closed a couple of hours early. Hazel wore her best Sunday dress, a flowery number that complemented her gentle demeanor. Lou wore a pressed shirt and tie, the same slightly too tight tie he used only on special occasions. At the museum, which occupied a stately brick building just off Main Street, a small crowd had gathered. The curator, a dignified woman named Dr. Langley, presented Hazel and Lou with certificates of appreciation. Photographers snapped pictures, hands were shook, and a hush fell as Dr. Langley escorted everyone inside to view the artifacts in a display case. Inside, Hazel felt a flutter in her chest. The pieces had been polished, but they retained their old-world charm. Dr. Langley explained the significance of each candelabra, pointing out the maker's mark on the base. "We thought these items lost forever," the curator said softly. "We can't thank you enough." After the ceremony, Hazel and Lou returned to the diner. The quiet street glowed under lamps as they unlocked the door. It felt comforting to see the black and white floor tiles, the worn counter seats, and the chalk menu sign promising cornbread and soup. Hazel couldn't help but walk over to the squeaky floorboard near the register, giving it a gentle nudge with her foot. It only squeaked faintly, the same way it always had when too many footsteps overlapped. But from now on, she would hear it sound differently. The board would be a reminder of secrets hidden and discovered, of stolen histories and second chances. That night, she drowsed off at home, thinking about how easily mysteries can slip beneath one's feet in a small, unassuming town like Juniper Junction, and how sometimes all it takes to bring them to light is a sharp ear, a willingness to ask questions, and the sturdy comfort of a place like Lou's Diner, where everyone eventually comes together. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a peaceful routine. Mornings brought the sizzling of bacon on the griddle, and neighbors sharing local gossip over omelettes. Afternoons involved washing dishes, wiping tables, and brewing fresh pots of coffee. Evenings ended with the diner's lights winking out, leaving only the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But beneath that ordinary rhythm was a shared memory that made Juniper Junction a little more special, a memory of the day they found a sunken trunk full of treasures, and in doing so reminded everyone that every community has its own buried truths. For Hazel, it was a comforting thought. She'd watch customers come and go, families chatting over dinner and travelers passing through, and in the back of her mind, she'd hold the assurance that hidden stories could be uncovered with a keen sense of curiosity and a bit of luck. Juniper Junction would carry on quietly, but it would forever bear the mark of the long-lost antiques that once lay beneath its diner floorboards, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring them into the light.